Hello and welcome to tonight's talk, Living with Ruskin, Edmund de Waal and Professor Tim Barringer in conversation. My name is Narissa Taysom and I manage the public programme at Watts Gallery Artist Village, and I'm delighted to be chairing this evening's event. As it happens, I'm speaking from Denmark Hill, where John Ruskin lived and worked for many years. But wherever you are joining us from around the world, a very warm welcome to the What's at Home online public programme. Before I introduce our speakers and say a few words about tonight's talk, I have a few housekeeping notices. The talk will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a Q&A. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions during the talk. I will monitor this throughout and then we will chair the discussion at the end. Questions can be anonymous. If you have any technical issues, please email the online duty manager, Karis, whose email address has been shared in the chat box. Please note that the chat function has otherwise been disabled for this talk. A reminder that the talk is being recorded and may be used on our website following the event, but please do not record it on your own devices. Lastly, if you're enjoying tonight's discussion, please let us know via Twitter and Instagram at Watts Gallery. We'd really love to hear from you. Tonight is the second in our series of online talks, bringing artists, writers and thinkers together to engage critically with the life, work and radical influence of John Ruskin. The public programme has been put together to sit alongside our current exhibition, Onto This Last 200 Years of John Ruskin, a collaborative endeavour with the collections and curators of the Yale Centre for British Art and the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. The exhibition, which is open at the Watts Gallery until the 1st of November, was curated by 3 PhD candidates in Yale University's Department of the History of Art, Tara Contractor, Victoria Hepburn and Judith Stapleton, in collaboration with Professor Tim Barringer and Courtney Skipton Long, Acting Assistant Curator of Prints and Drawings. If you're in the UK and would like to visit the show before it closes, I would strongly urge you to book a time ticket to visit the gallery. And now to introduce our speakers. As mentioned, Tim Barringer is the Paul Mellon Centre Professor of History of Art at Yale. He's a specialist in 18th, 19th and 20th century art of Britain and the British Empire, 19th century American and German art, and also museum studies. He has previously held posts at the V&A Museum, the University of London and the University of Birmingham, and between 2013 and 14, he held a J. Clawson Mills Fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. In 2009, Barringer was the Slade Professor of Fine Art at the University of Cambridge, and last year Barringer delivered the Paul Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery in London on global landscape in an age of empire. Alongside publications on subjects as varied as Rubens, David Hockney and Benjamin Britten, he has curated international exhibitions at the Tate, National Gallery of Art, Washington, DC, the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, Princeton University Art Museum and the Met, with touring exhibitions, including, of course, our very own exhibition, Onto This Last, currently on view at the Watts Gallery. I'm so pleased to welcome you, Tim, and you've joined us from the States, so a very warm welcome to you. And to our second speaker, Edmund de Waal, who almost needs no introduction. Edmund is a world-renowned artist and writer who in both practices has explored ideas of memory, diaspora, and the histories of loss and exile. Critically engaging with subjects as varied as architecture, music, dance, and poetry, de Waal has continually pushed the boundaries of ceramic practice for the last 30 years, creating interventions and artworks for museums and institutions worldwide. Recent projects include the Library of Exile, a pavilion of 2,000 books written by those forced to leave their own countries, first shown at the Venice Biennial last year and now on display at the British Museum until January 2021. Elective affinities at the Frick Collection, White Island at Mace, Ibiza, Morandi de Waal at Artipelag in Stockholm, During the Night at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, a major reworking of the historic collections, and Needed Knowledge, the Language of Ceramics, a group exhibition co-curated with Ai Weiwei at the Kunsthaus Graz in 2016. In 2010, de Waal published his best-selling memoir, The Hair with Amber Eyes, which won many literary prizes and has been translated into over 30 languages. His second book, The White Road, was published in 2015. De Waal was made an OBE for his services to art in 2011, And in a lovely connection to Tim's current institution, he was also awarded the Wyndham Campbell Prize for Nonfiction by Yale University in 2015. Tim, Edmund, as friends and longtime collaborators, it is a huge honour and privilege to welcome you this evening, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections on just what John Ruskin means to you.
Thank you, Narissa. Thank you so much. Can we all hear each other? Hello, Tim.
Yes, hi. I can now we can all hear each other. Yes.
Hi. That was a very generous and rather scary introduction to us.
It certainly was. I mean, the way I prefer to think of it is two undergraduates sitting probably on some creaking Cambridge settee, you know, with a beverage, talking about John Ruskin. So perhaps we can go back to that, you know, that moment when we first did. I wonder if I could just spend a second thanking those who were responsible for the exhibition. First of all, it's an utter thrill to see this exhibition in the Watts Gallery, which is one of my favorite places in the world, and just delightful to see a show which came from working with this wonderful group of graduate students, 3 graduate students and a curator at the Yale Center for British Art. I'll just name them again: Tara Contractor, Victoria Hepworth, Judith Stapleton, and Courtney Skipton Long, because the enthusiasm of these young scholars for John Ruskin has completely re-energized my thinking about him. And to think of Ruskin in the exhibition, we didn't just present his work, which is richly represented, but we tried to gather together a group of objects which actually did justice to his thinking and to his interventions as a moral thinker, as an aesthetic thinker, as well as an artist and critic. It includes material from his visits to Venice, from his defense of the Pre-Raphaelites, his love of Turner, his close study of the natural world, his educational projects, and his global influence. I do hope if you have a chance to get to Compton in the next couple of weeks, you'll have a chance to see it. But I suppose the key to the exhibition and the conversations that we had at Yale, and I really want to get Edmund's response to this, is that we argued that from the beginning, Ruskin was always a cultural, social, moral critic, that his love of art and nature were intertwined with his larger project, which in a sense expanded aesthetics to incorporate ethics, that actually expanded looking at art, looking at nature, to a larger question, which is the value of human life, the value of labor. He saw the destruction of nature as the epitome of evil, the destruction of nature for profit particularly. He believed that by looking closely at the natural world and at the historical accretion of architecture around us, we could learn to live together, essentially. And the reason we chose the title Unto This Last, and this is my last sentence really, is because at the core of that text is this phrase: there is no wealth but life, life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. And that seemed to us to get to the core of John Ruskin. So that's what the show is all about. But I'd love to, and it looks beautiful, incidentally, at the Watts Gallery. It looked quite beautiful at Yale, but it really looks more beautiful, frankly, at the Watts because of this gorgeous wall color. But I want to ask Edmund and start the chat really by saying, you know, where did you first encounter Ruskin? And because you already knew him when we met when we were 18, and has he changed for you since then? Perhaps that's what we can think.
Yes, I mean, I just kind of footnote, but actually we met on our first day at university.
Yeah.
I had the room above yours.
That's right.
And I think I came down the stairs to tell you to turn your Marla down on the first day. So we've been talking ever since. Where did I discover Ruskin? Well, it was difficult not to discover Ruskin for me because I grew up in cathedrals. I grew up in Gothic buildings, and I had an architectural historian for a mother who had written about Christian socialism, F.D. Maurice and Ruskin in the 50s and 60s, and written about topography and about Victorian industrial towns. So our childhood holidays were spent visiting bits of the West Midlands, looking at industrial buildings, and going home to kind of Gothic houses. So it was a kind of weird childhood. I mean, really weird childhood. But Ruskin was part of it right from the beginning. So I knew about him, and I read him pretty early on as a teenager, and was completely seduced, as everyone is who actually reads him, by the gravitas and energy of the prose, by that extraordinary propulsive energy in his writing. He makes places, buildings, trees, a leaf, a rock, the passageway into spaces, completely alive. So if you're a romantic teenager, which I was, there was Ruskin. Of course, we may talk about that a little bit more, but that's the beginning for me. So when I came up, studied English, Ruskin was part of that study.
That's really fascinating. I haven't actually heard you quite explain it so beautifully before, but I do remember that we both already read this when we arrived, and for me as someone really committed from a sort of slightly eccentrically, embarrassingly early age to the sort of rehabilitation of Victorian art, that was the way that I came to Ruskin as an art critic. But I think you can't go on believing that Ruskin is merely an art critic as soon as you dip into the prose. I'm sure we've both got a couple of things we'd like to read, but I just can't resist sharing with you a quote, which, for all that it's well known, still retains its power.
Yeah.
The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and to tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds of people can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion, all in one. And that, to me, goes to the core of his project. I mean, I wanted, so go on, please.
Go on, Tim, go on.
No, I just wanted, because you are someone who has, you mentioned leaves, so let's go to a leaf. You are someone who is a maker and a writer. And at the core of Ruskin is this binary in a way, although I'd like to think of it more as two sides of the same thing, in which he's constantly making works of art, making beautiful drawings. And yet his product is also, his thinking also manifests itself through theory and through poetry and through writing. And that's an aspect of your own life, which has emerged almost since, I know it was already there in some way when you were a student, but since then you have professionally pursued this binary. And I wonder if that side of Ruskin is powerful for you.
Well, it's very interesting to think of it as two sides of the coin, because of course it isn't.
Right.
You know, it's one thing. It's a powerful pull between which happens in that wonderful quote you just did, where he talks about looking and seeing, and the extraordinary generative power of actually looking. And for him, that segues, of course, into the act of seeing, which is the act of drawing, the act of bringing the whole of your body into your hand and your eye, into a somatic experience of actually seeing something as an individual object, as a particular thing. Look at this wonderful leaf here. This is every single autumnal oak leaf. Series of oak leaves, but of course it's got complete identity as a singular thing seen at that particular moment, and it isn't to make that a moral act, to say that to see something with that clarity and to put it aside in the world, to give it its own space, which is what Ruskin is endlessly, iteratively trying to make people do. is his great vision. And that, of course, will take us into work and into social, into the whole social contract that he has, and into the morals of architecture, everything else. But actually that idea of seeing something singularly for what it is the moment, the beginning of everything. So for me as a maker, you know, my apprenticeship in Japan and in Canterbury, but was all about that, was all about you make one thing, you look at it carefully and you put it aside. So to discover Ruskin's passionate advocacy for this act, of course, spoke hugely to me as a youngster. I can't remember what you asked, actually.
No,
I'm burbling on.
No, you've answered it perfectly, and I think that explains why this tiny piece of paper, which is only 1/3 covered with painting, so it could be considered to be unfinished or a sketch or preparatory, actually carries such inordinate weight. And as we placed this in the galleries at Yale, we became aware of the fact that actually the entire thesis of the exhibition, and indeed basically the whole of Ruskin's achievement, can be seen within this object, which encapsulates, as you say, every oak tree, but then this specific oak tree. And also I think Ruskin would say the whole life of an oak tree, yes, from its inception to its death, through this. And it's the same when he starts looking at geology, and we'll come back to that in a second, but in geology, where the rock, if you look at it with sufficient precision and with seriousness, will actually narrate the history of the world, including perhaps the impending end of the world. The whole history of life is to be found by looking closely. This is an extraordinary watercolor from the Fitzwilliam Amazing Loan, which is in the exhibition. Very, very grateful to see it. And every detail, the closer you get, I mean, Ruskin didn't have an iPhone to do this, but he did have eyes that would take him so closely that you can see the reflections through the water, modified by the iron in the water of the rock beneath the surface. These are really extraordinary philosophical statements, I think. And the one that I'd like to get your response to this, actually, Edmund, because this is what we picked as the emblem of the exhibition. Victoria Hepburn wrote a wonderful essay about the illustrations to Ruskin's modern painters. And this is called The Dryads Waywardness, which has got to be one of the great titles for a drawing.
Yes.
But it's a steel engraving printed in purple ink of an oak sapling seen from a sort of eccentric angle. But I'd love to get your just an immediate response to this extraordinary living thing which Ruskin somehow made.
Well, of course, it's such a provocative image to have, isn't it? Because, as you say, it's like the oak leaf. It uses part of the paper, but almost in a kind of Oriental way. It has powerful use of negative space. It takes over the space in a way that shows that he cares about, again, the complete specific nature of this moment in this life of this. It's calligraphic, of course, but what it also does is lead you so strongly into architecture. It leads you so strongly into what he's looking at here, of course, is the forces of nature. He's looking and trying to think through, how does this particular plant grow, and why does it grow in this way? And if I can understand that and look at it and watch its burgeoning moment, this extraordinary unfolding moment, then I will be able to understand how the world should be, how I might think about a building happening, how I might think about a shelter happening, how I might think about an object having meaning in the world. So it's, again, as you say, it's a moral act, because he's looking at something growing and saying, actually, it takes this amount of space.
That's exquisitely Ruskinian reading of Ruskin, and I thank him for it. It's interesting to think that Charlotte Bronte said on reading the text of Modern Painters that this book gives me eyes to see. And I think for a generation of Victorian readers who were so deeply rooted in text, to have the illustrations not just be secondary, but actually in a way be driving the argument, and to have the image preceding the argument, and to have the object as more important than the idea in some ways. And that is a really powerful inversion of 300 years of Protestant logocentrism. Interestingly, since Ruskin was himself, in some ways a part of that. You've mentioned, sorry, am I going the right way? We will go on because time is pressing, as you have taken us so beautifully to architecture. Now, did you, as it were, bring Ruskin with you the first time you encountered Venice? How does Ruskin shape the way one looks at it?
I have an embarrassing photograph which I haven't shared with, which is showing me reading The Stones of Venice in Torcello, age 17, taken by my brother, age 16, sitting on the steps, looking like a complete prat, I have to say. But actually, you know what? Here I am, with my Stones of Venice, which I took with me 40 years ago. And actually, and so why Venice? I mean, why Venice? I mean, let's go into Venice. Venice, the golden stain of time. I mean, that's thank you, Snap. It's that extraordinary, again, bringing with violence together the idea of the civic life, architecture, society, moral decay, all into this riveting read about. I mean, it reads incredibly about why buildings matter, what they tell you, what you learn from them, how you can look at them, and it's astonishing because it feels like he has no orthodoxy in this at all. It feels like it's come. I know you, damn God's sake, you're the Mellon professor of everything, but it feels to me like when I read it, there's no antecedents to this kind of writing about architecture. Am I wrong?
No, absolutely not. And I think there are few who have dared to follow it as well, which is a shame in a way, because, well, let me just, I think Ruskin can say it better. If you don't, will you indulge me for?
Yeah. Actually, yeah.
Do you want to say something before we plunge? Edmund, you're frozen in my. Are we okay?
Am I? Oh, we're okay. I was just expecting to read it like a preacher.
You froze. Okay. I shall now do my best to give voice to what I think is still one of the most thrilling pages in the English language, which is the first page of Volume 1 of The Stones of Venice, 1851, and it compels us to connect what we see in history with what we live in life. So, since first the dominion of men was asserted over the ocean, 3 thrones of mark beyond all others have been set upon its sands, the thrones of Tyre, Venice, and England. Of the first of these great powers, only the memory remains. Of the second, the ruin. The third, which inherits their greatness, if it forget their example, may be led through prouder eminence to less pitied destruction. And that, of course, is England. Venice is still left for our beholding in the final period of her decline, a ghost upon the sands of the sea, so weak, so quiet, so bereft of all but her loveliness, that we might well doubt, as we watched her faint reflection in the mirage of the lagoon, which was the city and which the shadow. I would endeavor to trace the lines of this image before it be forever lost, and to record as far as I may the warning which seems to me to be uttered by every one of the fast gaining waves that beat like passing bells against the stones of Venice. I mean, a manifesto for architectural history. but also, you know, something we wish our leaders today would read. You know,
it's so extraordinary, isn't it? It's absolutely extraordinary, because what he dares to do is talk about decline. I mean, he actually, you know, this is at the moment of the greatest moment of imperial grandeur for England and its dominions. I mean, you couldn't get a more pompous moment in British history.
right.
And there's someone saying it may pass. You know, it may pass. Look to yourself, and it's such an extraordinary prophetic sound. And I must say, you read it like a preacher's son. That's so why it's so amazing, because he takes that gloriously cadenced tone, and actually then explores it with great passion and power through the city. But it leaves you at the end reflecting on the state you're in, the state of England. This, you know, and it's a great cry to get to work, isn't it? To make things happen.
It is, but it's also a critique of the way people have been working. I think it's no coincidence that this was published exactly at the moment the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace, opened in London, which is the sort of temple of the mass-produced commodity. And that's really where Ruskin's intervention into contemporary life seems to be the most powerful. We tend to think of him as an art critic who changed art, but I suspect that art would have followed a similar pattern without Ruskin. But I do think that his sowing at the seed, at the heart of Victorian capitalism, of a critique, a really powerful critique of the way people spend their lives making things, is actually more important than, you know, a particular emphasis in aesthetics. So let's think perhaps about, you know, I've put several things in, but Ruskin and the machine. Ruskin, this is the machine court at the Crystal Palace.
The Great Conservatory. Didn't he call it a Great Conservatory?
No, he called it a cucumber frame.
Okay.
A giant cucumber frame. Yes. Which, and of course, it was even worse that the Crystal Palace migrated into basically his back garden at Sydenham. So when it was moved in 1854. So no, he loathed this building because it's prefabricated and every piece is identical and shipped in from Birmingham, and you know, it's an IKEA bookshelf essentially. It's flat pack. But I wonder, you know, if you could speak to us, Edmund, about how the ceramic industry, or how the production of ceramics was affected by this critique. You know, because after all, one of the greatest displays at the Crystal Palace was the Staffordshire mass-produced ceramic, which was a triumph of British industry.
Yeah. So at this moment, you know, 1850, in Britain leads the world in ceramics. It has the greatest industrial ceramic production in the world, and exports beautifully machined, produced by hundreds of people. Every single object would have been passed from hand to hand to hand in the great factories of Stoke-on-Trent, the nightmare factories of Stoke-on-Trent, you know, where it's a pall of smoke covers the city by day and flames by night, famously. And those ceramics, of course, have taken away any specific nature. They are mass-produced, they are replicated ad infinitum. But for Ruskin, his critique says there is no hand. You know, there is no connection, no workman, no child, no woman on the production line, no decorator can take any pride in their work, any connection to their work, because like the great cogs that you're showing here, they have been taken into bits. There's a disparaction, there's a breaking apart, so that all that they can do is some woman in Stoke-on-Trent in a factory, all she does is to put one gold mark, you know, on a teacup as it gets passed from hand to hand to hand, or the cleaning of a mold repeatedly by a workman outside the kiln. So there's no honor left in work, and what he sees there, he sees the sort of the pain of this. You feel he sees the pain of the loss of any dignity for around work. And he writes and begins to bring into kind of public discourse the need to restore the dignity of work, restore the individuality of the worker, to be able to see what they have done.
Yes, that's beautifully phrased. I mean, and it's quite extraordinary that in a book on the architecture of Venice, which frankly you would expect to be mainly about Palladio and the triumph of the classical, that's what every other book on the architecture of Venice did. Ruskin has a whole huge section, first of all, on Gothic churches in Northern Europe, and secondly, on how, if we look closely at Gothic churches and the facade of Gothic buildings in Venice, we can actually see where we have gone wrong. I mean, that's the most remarkable thing. So there's a whole section in The Stones of Venice where he talks about the slavery in our England, 1,000 times worse than that in ancient Greece. Now, of course, there's a whole way in which to compare chattel slavery to industrial labor is somehow obscene. But what he means is that there is no expression of individuality possible within the construction of an object like this. And when he reviews this painting in 1854 at the Royal Academy, William Holman Hunt's The Awakening Conscience, he uses this extraordinary phrase, the fatal newness of the piano. That actually this thing is a kind of death, even though it's the most elaborate piano you could ever imagine, works perfectly, and it has this sheen across it, that actually somewhere someone has died. Somebody's interiority has died because they have been producing, just the keys or just the steel wire or the frame of the piano, and they have no sense of ownership or creativity in the product. And the man who designed the piano is in an office somewhere, totally separated from the woodworkers and the metal workers who actually make the object. And that seems to me to be part of a larger, and this I'm sure is a figure in your mother's wonderful study of Christian socialism, but it's part of a larger crisis around triumphant narratives, of which you've talked about, the pomposity of British history, which continues really as a kind of farcical discourse into the present. But this painting, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this in relation to Ruskin. This is Ford Madox Brown's work, which took him 13 years to paint, so there's no denying the work that went into it. But I'd love to hear more about the ways in which you could connect a social realist project like this to Ruskin's architectural thinking, or how that weaves together.
God, I feel like I'm in a PhD seminar in Yale.
Yes, you are.
Didn't you write your PhD on this work?
Yes.
Well, damn it! It's your turn, Tim, to talk about this. I mean, this is everyone. This is the great painting on. This is work, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Go on. You talk about this, and then I'll talk about Sheffield. I mean,
well, I was hoping that would be where we could go. The idea that Ruskin's idea of labor has a slightly more aestheticized quality than Madox Brown's, which is really about, if you express yourself through hard work, there doesn't have to be an aesthetic product. There can be a social good, like digging a hole in the road to lay water pipes in Hampstead, which is what's going on here. And the people who are doing that, who have previously been the sort of smelly, villainous, marginalized working class, as far as any elite discourse was concerned, are now suddenly the heroes. And the people who have been in the leadership positions for the previous 500 years are now shadowed and marginalized. I suppose my question for you is, how radical is Ruskin, before we get to Sheffield? How fundamental is the upheaval that his works imply. What do you think about that, Edmund?
Well, I think they are extraordinary. I mean, I think they are profoundly radical. Because I think because he identifies the value of the specific, going all the way back to drawing, of the specific, he sees in the work of hand and heart, the specifics of labor, whether it's digging a road well, or carving like the O'Shea brothers did, the capitals in the new museum in Oxford, which he creates. What he's doing is saying, whatever you do, if you own the act of doing it, then you are a fully realized human being. Of course, it's extraordinarily radical and extraordinarily romantic at the same time. And we're talking here about someone who is hugely rich.
Yes.
But that idea is radical. I mean, there's and in his lectures, I'm thinking of Fors Clavigera and his letters. I'm thinking of his Unto This Last. I'm thinking of all those extraordinary public statements that he does. What he's saying is, look to the value of work. Look to it. Understand what it means, because if you can understand labor, then you have the chance of rebuilding a proper and just society. And that takes him into some wonderful, complicated, misguided avenues, including setting up the Guild of St. George, setting up this extraordinary guild, which and sending collections to Sheffield to educate the, to educate the working poor. He chooses Sheffield, a city completely covered in misery, enduring clouds of smoke, pale-faced teeming populations, tall chimneys and ash heaps covered with squalid children picking them over, dirty alleys, houses, half rooftops, rivers running black through the midst of them. That's the Sheffield he describes, and he brings to this house in Sheffield, which he buys and creates, objects, minerals, illuminated manuscripts, drawings, works of extraordinary things, in order to, and books, hundreds and hundreds of books, in order to help the poor artisans of Sheffield understand what labor might mean.
Yeah, and it's really fascinating that he chose Sheffield. And in a second, I'm going to ask why you chose Sheffield to move to yourself. But I just wanted to add that Ruskin does explain that you can see something of a trace of the Gothic in the work of the metal workers of Sheffield. Yeah. He's particularly committed to, and what he calls the old Yorkshire workmen, as opposed to the sort of modern division of labor in the Manchester factories, textile factories. And I do think that's quite fascinating, that he sees a redemptive possibility in iron and ironwork. There's a set of wonderfully rich metaphors around iron in Ruskin that Judith Stapleton brings out in her.
Great essay. It's a great essay. Yeah.
Yeah. There's oxidation and rust and dust, but there's also fabrication and mending and bending. So there's a possibility that these men, in this wonderful painting by Godfrey Sykes that's in the exhibit, that these men, rather than the withered operatives of a Manchester factory, would have enough of sort of this energy to be the basis for a sort of revolution that takes place in this room. And I think that's fascinating. So that's Ruskin. What about you, Edmund? What about
but he also sees in Sheffield that there's this great tradition of the little Mesters' yards. So amongst all the factories, there are these small units, of small groups of cutlers who are little masters. And so for him, that's an extraordinary, almost medieval, guild-like idea that you can be responsible for your own manufacture. So he brings this to Sheffield. And in fact, when I was 22, I moved to Sheffield for the extraordinarily good reason, Tim, you will remember that it was the cheapest place in England I could work. And I bought a little Mester's yard on the edge of Attercliffe, just as the steelworks were all in
that.
That was, yes, that I'm just down there.
Right.
And I did the completely bonkers thing of trying to make porcelain on a back street of Sheffield in a little Mester's yard. And in some ways, it was a economic decision about trying to set myself up somewhere. But in another way, it was also, a bit Ruskinian. I really wanted to see if I could make, cheap porcelain in an industrial town. And of course, I couldn't. It didn't work. But Ruskin was absolutely was at my back the whole time, and Ruskin's there being very patrician and I guess actually, looking back 40 years, I was probably doing exactly the same thing,
Yeah, but it didn't. I don't think you're quite fair on yourself to say it didn't work, because surely that was a different kind of apprenticeship to working with a master in Japan. But it was in itself it was a good Victorian test of technique and skill and enterprise and all sorts of. And you did make lots of, because several of us bought objects that you made there for enormous prices, like 35 quid, I think it was, for an early de Waal, which we still treasure. But and they're very beautiful objects, although very different from what you've done since. But would you have been the same potter had you not had that?
No, I wouldn't. And so it was a testing ground, and I don't regret it. It was difficult, but it was trying something out. And what I was trying out was trying to be an urban potter. So I'd been in Japan and I worked on a Herefordshire hillside, digging my own clay or blah blah blah, doing that whole thing, that whole shtick, the ruralist thing. And actually, I wanted to try and work in a city. I really did. I wanted to put my own labour, such as it was, alongside other people's labour and see how that tested. It was complicated and hugely ambivalent, but that was a test. And Sheffield wasn't a bad place to do it.
I think it's really fascinating that the Ruskinian legacy can be both the ruralist, through the William Morris Arts and Crafts Cotswolds legacy, but also this, I think, more radical tradition of, actually attempting to change, as it were, the heart of the industrial world, and to do it through this process of aesthetic rather than a process of political change, because Ruskin is extremely skeptical about conventional politics.
Yeah.
That itself is quite fascinating, and we haven't too much time left, but I did want to just spend a moment. We will move to Japan shortly, because you've suggested how that's linked. But Unto This Last is such an extraordinary document, and I've read it now with different groups of students over 25 years, and each time you read it, it seems both more eccentric and more absolutely of the moment that we're living in. It's one of those texts that has the potential to be reignited by different circumstances. This is the moment when Ruskin tried to basically occupy the one of the great journals of the day, the Cornhill, which was a standard sort of liberal journal in Victorian England that people read very widely, and wrote these astonishingly radical articles on art and political economy, the way in which there is no difference between the aesthetic and the ethical, and that essentially the entire framework of economic thinking which is common sense, is what we call it now. There's no way around it unless you read Ruskin, who actually says that value does not reside in money. And I mean, imagine saying that to the country that invented capitalism at the moment when it was actually successful at being capitalist. And he said, there's no value in this. It's worthless. Of course, it's easy to say that if you're quite well off, but still, he said, there is no wealth but life. And that is one of those extraordinary moments where he cuts through and causes an absolute crisis, such that the general public opinion of the day insists that it's like being screamed at by a mad governess, is what one of them said. This attempt to feminize him, to marginalize him. But that is the text which he took to Oxford, where he gave these increasingly eccentric Slade lectures, wonderfully enough, taking Oscar Wilde and Arnold Toynbee to dig a road in Ferry Hinksey. But it's also, we'll come back to that in a second, but it's also what Mahatma Gandhi read. It was Unto This Last, not Modern Painters, not Stones of Venice, that Gandhi read on a train in South Africa, in Durban, and essentially on the basis of that text, he paraphrased it into Gujarati. And transformed himself into someone who makes simple things with his own hands, from being this urbane, middle-class, privileged lawyer. And then finally, his own texts are deeply rooted in this. I mean, there are many other sources as well in Hindu thinking and so on, but nonetheless, deeply rooted in this one fundamental insight. And it seems to me that is unprecedented in that an aesthete and an art critic and a person who inhabits a position of such utter privilege should be able to puncture through the carapace of the British Empire with this simple statement, which I think actually did really materially affect the history of India. And that, to me, that's still incredibly moving and powerful.
It is extraordinarily moving, and that afterlife of it, which you Adam wrote beautifully there, Tim. That it also, of course, affects Tolstoy.
Yes.
Radically, and Walt Whitman radically. It goes deeply into people's consciousness, and some of the people whose lives it changes are then produce social movements like Gandhi, like Tolstoy, for goodness sake, which then completely alter the last 120 years of. So there is no wealth but life. As you say, it punctures something. It doesn't just break it apart. It just completely makes you start again. And it's not about aesthetics, So it's that's what's so powerful about Ruskin. You can cut him into as many different bits as you like. As an artist, as a educator, whatever. But that statement is the most extraordinary legacy of all, and it goes around the world.
Yes, it does. So please, sorry, I have a. These are images of Ruskin, but I'd love to hear you just weave together your thinking about Ruskin.
So I go to Japan as a teenager, but then I go back when I'm in my late 20s to study Leach and write about him and try and get him off my back, and discover really that there has been a massive Ruskinian movement in Japan. Ruskin tea rooms, for goodness sake, with the working men of the villages outside Tokyo making no wealth but life medals in bronze. Miyazawa Kenji, one of the great poets and storytellers of Japan, early Japan, builds a Ruskinian village in his hometown. And the poor peasants on his father's estate have to study geology in the evenings and play the harpsichord. and do English folk dancing, but all in the spirit of Ruskin. So there's and the Ruskin tea rooms, of which these are wonderful images, are radical places where young, interested, Western-looking, well-off Japanese intellectuals gather and talk about no wealth but life, talk about aesthetics, talk about how to change society. And one of them is Yonagi Soetsu, who is the great mentor of Bernard Leach. So Leach comes back 100 years ago to Britain, never having read Ruskin, except in Japan. So he understands, he has his life changed by Ruskin in Japan, and brings that back. And the whole of the studio pottery movement, which we know comes from this mélange of Britain and Japan, is via this wonderful, complicated circuit of people, young people, reading Ruskin earnestly in these tea rooms. So it's one of those great circuits that Ruskin creates in the modern world.
Absolutely. Now, but your book on Leach is a wonderfully ambivalent document. It's one of the most beautiful sets of descriptions of pots, and yet there is a critique within it, which I think seemed to be very important for you to articulate at that particular moment. And is that a critique of Ruskinianism, or is that a critique of some other part of Leach's legacy, which is not in this circuit?
It's a critique of other bits of Leach. It's a critique of him, of his. It's not about Ruskin.
Right.
It's about Leach's muddle, really. It's about Leach's chaotic rhetoric of wanting to make things for people to have and hold, but actually really hating doing it, wanting to be art pots, and him, closing down huge ideas about what ceramics can be in the process. So it's some critic put it's rather Oedipal, but I'm trying to kill my dad rather firmly with that book. It's rather a cross book.
Whereas Ruskin is the great uncle that we can all be affectionate.
Exactly, indeed. Yes.
Well, we were almost at the end of our time, but I did want to think back to reading first time, when we were students, this text which has the best title, The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. It's in way at the end of the volumes of Cook and Wedderburn. There we have it. Absolutely. Is that you've had that by you for many years, I'm sure. And I must admit, when I read it in 1983, I found this text disappointing, because I was expecting it to be this summation of Ruskin's ideas, because it comes at the end of his collected works, and it's this sort of, it sounds as if it's going to be a history of the 19th century. And it turns out that it is, but I wasn't positioned, none of us were, I think, at that time, to understand that Ruskin's writing about the environment, which is absolutely there from 1843 Modern Painters Volume 1, Chapter 1, actually not prefigured, because he already saw it. He simply noticed by the process of looking, just as he looked at an oak leaf, he looked at the sky and he noticed it was changing in ways that he was able, through this double process of, first of all, analytic looking and then interpretative sort of poetics, to realize contained within it, a terrible portent of death. And we're now we look out of the window and we can all see what Ruskin saw in 1875. There's this the last little bit that I thought we had to just acknowledge the sheer portent in this. A cloud Ruskin saw at Bolton Abbey in 1875, in the middle of the countryside, but 60 miles from Manchester, looked as if it were made of poisonous smoke. Very possibly it may be. There are at least 200 furnace chimneys in a square of 2 miles on either side of me, but mere smoke would not blow to and fro in that wild way. It looks more to me as if it were made of dead men's souls. This is the storm cloud of the 19th century, a phenomenon hitherto unrecorded in the course of nature. And of course, this is the birth of environmental critique, essentially. And what's so fantastic is the way that Ruskin wraps it straight back in to the scene of labor. And that dead man's soul is the very same man who is burning the carbon, but not creating some sort of product that he can own himself. It's Marx said some of the same things, but in a much less interesting way, and didn't get the environmental side of it. And to me, this is incredibly powerful. I'd love to know what your response to this book is, because I feel like it's taken me until now to understand.
Do you know, I'm with you. I mean, I read it, but it's only in the last. I made a work called Atmosphere a few years ago for Margate, which we actually used. The researcher was involved in that whole project. We used this text, but you know, me too. You know, it's absolutely it's of the moment, and actually the last few lines, you know, that harmony is now broken, and broken the world around. Fragments indeed of what existed still exist, and hours of what is past still return, but month by month the darkness gains upon the day. What consolation or what courage you can find in the conviction that you are nothing more than brute beasts driven by brute forces. Your other tutors can tell you, not I. But it's an extraordinary moment of where he absolutely sees the interconnectedness of the world. We talked about the separation of the world into these fragments, which is how he looks at the world. But this is the interpenetration of everything into the storm cloud, and it makes for very, very powerful reading now. It's probably a good moment to finish, isn't it?
I think we should do that. We should open up for questions. But it's been such a pleasure to continue a conversation of 37 years. Ruskin.
It's a kind of Ruskinian lock-in for us. But such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim and Edmund. What an enthralling conversation, and sort of taking us on this both personal and global perspective on Ruskin. We're so fortunate to have had this opportunity to hear you both speak. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'll rattle through them if that's okay. So firstly, a question to both of you about the relevance of Ruskin today, in particular thinking about the audiences without any prior knowledge of him and without an art history background.
Tim.
Oh gosh. Well, I don't think you need an art history background for Ruskin, actually, because he's not really talking about art history. So what's exciting about Ruskin is that, and we've found this with the school groups coming to the exhibition and teaching with undergraduates, that the combination of the investment in looking closely at the natural world, which is such an important thing for young people who perceive it like he did as something threatened, something worth cherishing. And then the layer of anti-industrial critique, the layer of a kind of really a utopian idea that we can do better. These things speak very directly to young people. I mean, frankly, the only people who find Ruskin really difficult are people who grew up with traditional art history educations, who think that the only interesting thing in the 19th century is Manet, and they, those are the irredeemable. You can't get through that. But anyone who doesn't know anything about art history immediately finds Ruskin fantastic. Yeah. I would say the other thing is that if you try to sit down and read him cold, sometimes the sentences are so long. And what I always say to people is, go to the bathroom, lock the door, and read it out loud. And if you can have a space where you can just intone Ruskin, suddenly it makes sense. That's the best answer.
We'll be introducing that soon into the public programme, Tim. Thanks. A question actually, and that works very well with that previous question about who in the public eye would benefit most from reading Ruskin today.
You can do that.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, let's start with all the people who closed libraries down in this country. I mean, you know, let's talk about austerity, the destruction of the opportunities to use materials in schools, you know, to make things, the closing down of local libraries so that you can't have silent, you know, you can't, wherever you are in the UK, you can't go and find a silent place and go and pull a book off a shelf anymore. Let's talk about the stripping out of music from the curriculum. You know, any of those people who are responsible for some of those moments in children's lives where actually you could look at things, draw them, make them, listen to them, go for a walk, or read a book, because actually you have to have a curriculum which is like a kind of Stakhanovite factory owner in the early 19th century.
Radgrind, yes.
Radgrind. So that's a good start. That would be a good start. And we don't have time enough for me to get on my high horse, Narissa, but it's there.
Well, let me just add that, in fact, it turns out that the two of us who grew up in the late 60s into the 70s, actually, in retrospect, although it seemed pretty crummy at the time, were in a little bubble of Ruskinian utopia, because the people who designed the welfare state and the 1944 Education Act and the BBC Radio 3 and the South Kensington Museum and all of the things that allowed Britain to be just a little bit better than some other places like the United States, frankly, I can say as a citizen of both. Those people were Ruskinians. You know, Jenny Lee, the arts minister, under Harold Wilson, was a card-carrying Ruskinian and did some, within limits, but some extraordinary things. And what's tragic is that instead of building upon that very remarkable inheritance that the United Kingdom has, that basically at the very moment you moved to Sheffield, we've seen that those extraordinary merits and benefits being chipped away at, and not replaced. I mean, there is an opportunity in Sheffield still to go and see the Ruskin collection, somewhat diminished from what it once was, but you can go and you can actually see it still works. Is his intervention into the city with just putting beautiful things together. It's in a shopping mall now, so you go from Pret a Manger to the Ruskin Museum, but even that, it still works. So it's not like it doesn't work anymore. It's just that people have chosen to undermine it. So.
Thinking about Sheffield, Tim, do you know how well Ruskin was received in Sheffield, and were his interventions welcomed, or did he receive any resistance or backlash when he installed the house?
Well, Edmund, I don't know if you know about that. I mean, I think the answer is that there wasn't a backlash, but equally there wasn't a revolution. So Ruskin's interventions were always symbolic. He wasn't a man to actually organize the proletariat to rise up. He was a person to open the door of a museum to which a few hundred people came, and it was a sort of symptomatic, small scale demonstration of what was possible. So I don't think he was chased out by angry local businessmen, but that's because he didn't make enough actual difference. There's this one wonderful moment when he was invited to go to Bradford to advise them on what kind of a town hall they should build. And he had the entire bourgeoisie of Bradford, including, Frederick Delius's father, the composer, all of these serious men. And he just harangued and insulted them for a whole hour and told them they were vulgar, that, they're ugly, they make their money in an ugly way, so they should have ugly buildings. So he did have these moments, and then there was the moment of the storm cloud, and there were several other, unto this last, where he got the national spotlight, but he never was actually organizing a movement like Keir Hardie or the suffragists or Gandhi. So in a way, there wasn't that kind of backlash because there wasn't that kind of immediate impact. The impact was, 40 years later in the Punjab, or 70 years later in Japan, or, maybe now. so he didn't get, he wasn't a political operator, so he didn't get political resistance.
We had a question here actually about Marx, who you mentioned before, and whether they were aware of each other. Did Ruskin know his work? You mentioned the use of the phrase "the value of labour," which reminds the questioner of Marx. Can you pick up on that?
Shall I go again, Edmund? Sorry, this is turning into a Yale.
That's definitely your question, Tim.
Well, I just taught a seminar for a whole term called Ruskin Marx. Actually, it was Ruskin Marx Modernity. And we tried to figure this out. Wonderful groups of students, because normally the people who write about Marx don't write about Ruskin, and vice versa. So there are two separate sets of literature which never quite meet. The answer is they didn't ever meet. Marx probably knew about Ruskin. Ruskin knew about Marx because William Morris told him. Neither of them, I think, really read each other. What's extraordinary is, though, that they found different vocabularies to explore and explain the same thing. And around 1848 to 51, they were essentially making the same kinds of arguments. And Marx, was always going to write this great aesthetic treatise. Marx studied art history. He's our favorite art history graduate. He took art history at the University of Bonn, and his classmate was Prince Albert, if you can imagine the two of them writing essays together. So Marx was interested in the aesthetic sphere, but strangely enough, in a highly conservative way. He was interested in kind of allegorical painting and in German Romanticism. So he didn't really perceive the overlap of the aesthetic and the productive. Marxists in the 20th century, you lent me a Herbert Marcuse volume, Edmund, 1983. I think I never gave it back. It's probably in 20th century Marxists did try to connect Marxian theory with aesthetic theory, but Marx himself was really an economist, and Ruskin said economics is a load of bunk. So they would never have converged. Is that a fair answer, Edmund? Do you think?
You've got it.
A question here about Ruskin's impact on contemporary craft and also contemporary artistic practice, and his relevance or impact. Where do we see him kind of sitting alongside contemporary makers today?
Well, I think it's got huge impact. It's very interesting. I mean, the idea of, I think, if you look at Jeremy Deller's work, if you look at Bob and Roberta Smith, if you even look at Grayson Perry, you'll see within their practices a kind of critique of the craft object or the art object. You'll see art and protest coming together. You'll see text and image working in interesting ways. So I think you'll find contemporary artists often get drawn to bits of Ruskin's oeuvre and get taken up and involved in it. I think that the whole sort of it's interesting because there's a sort of diffused Ruskinianism, which actually is a bit tepid, to be honest, which is where people haven't really been to your wonderful exhibition, or read him, but sort of think that he was in favour of generally good things, and that can lead to some unfortunate work. But there are some really very, very strong artists out there who are directly influenced and directly work with Ruskin's ideas. So he's around.
Just two more questions. One here about what Ruskin might have thought about contemporary cities and the rebuilding and fabrication of new buildings that don't necessarily last or have architectural value beyond a certain period. What would have Ruskin made of contemporary architecture?
Tim.
Well, I'll start. But I'm sure you have wonderful things to say. I mean, I just walked down through Central Park a couple of days ago in New York, all the way down the park, which is, of course, essentially a Ruskinian creation. Law and Olmsted, who laid out Central Park, were profoundly influenced by Ruskin, as was Frederick Church, one of the founders of the Met Museum. So there I was in this wonderful Ruskinian, these paths which wind through to sculptural elements which are hand carved, by individual sculptors. There's all sorts of Ruskinian moments. And then I looked up, and what used to be a beautiful view at the end of the park is now, absolutely destroyed by these toothpick-like billionaires' apartment buildings, which are now, for some reason of, I sound like Ruskin, they look essentially like cucumber frames. That they are essentially now able to build a building that can be as tall as you want. And so it has one apartment per floor, and it's 95 floors tall. And it cuts through the air, it cuts through the scenery, it actually imposes itself on you in the park. Almost all of them are empty because the people are abroad as for tax reasons, And this seems to me to epitomize, these are hideous buildings which don't suit the world around them, don't even think of the world around them, heavily fortified at the bottom, like the Shard, And that kind of intervention is a real violence. It's a real violence to the people who live in the city. It's a violence to, the very, very subtle ecology of a city, even a city like New York that Ruskin wouldn't have liked in the first place. So it seems to me that there is a possibility within contemporary design for very much a Ruskinian way forward, which is sensitive to the environment and to materials and to sustainability and to community. And, that's exactly the opposite of what we're actually building, particularly in the city of New York right now.
I absolutely concur. And I mean, the throwaway culture, from fashion to furniture to buildings, that is an environmental obscenity, and it would have appalled him, absolutely appalled him. I was profoundly upset today to see an image of a 250-year-old pear tree being cut down for the second oldest pear tree in our country, being cut down for the part of HS2. And for me, as I came over to the studio, I was thinking about that and thinking, about the specific nature of a pear tree, and what Ruskin would have done with the leaf of the pear tree, and it's autumn and this particular moment. And that seemed to me a kind of symbolic moment of this complete lack of the valuing of the environment, by which I mean built and unbuilt environment. Ruskin would have, I'm stopping, too upset.
Our last question for tonight, Tim and Edmund. If you were to meet Ruskin today, what in particular would you like to ask him or talk about in your discussions?
Oh my goodness me. Wow. What a wonderful question. Tim, have you got anything?
Well, I think one thing that does fascinate me, and I'm not sure that Ruskin would have been able to, as it were, step aside from the experience enough to articulate it, but something we haven't talked about, which is very important, is his relationship to Jmw Turner. And this is one of those extraordinary moments where Modern Painters was published as a defense of Turner when Turner was still alive. And so, it was one of these moments where a creative force of historical proportions, Turner, meets a critical intelligence, admittedly at that time young and raw, but also of historical world historical importance. And then the two of them are sitting in a room with Turner's painting The Slave Ship, which Ruskin owned, which is now in Boston, one of the most powerful objects I've ever seen in my life. And I would, Ruskin never really described that interaction. And that, he certainly describes all of his bullying of the Pre-Raphaelites and his, hectoring of this, that, and these people. But this is the moment when Ruskin is in the room with the man in the world he most admires. How was that intervention? And that would, I don't think Ruskin would tell me. I think he would say I was impertinent, which is true. But I would love to hear that. So that's my 2 penny worth.
And for me, it's not a question. I would just love to go for a walk with the man. I would absolutely love to know how fast he walked, what he saw, what he didn't see, whether he caught people's eyes as he walked down the road, whether you know, how he interacted, you know, with the world. I would just love to be alongside him for an hour.
And I think on that note, Edmund and Tim, I think we should leave it there for this evening. But thank you again for such an insightful, fascinating, as I say, enthralling evening. I think you've taken us on a real journey across the world, through literature, through architecture, through poetry, through mantras that I think we all need to keep alongside us in the coming days and weeks. So huge thanks for joining us this evening as part of our online programme. I also have to add my thanks to the Watts Gallery, to my director, Alistair Burton-Shaw, and to our trustees for supporting both this online public programme, but of course also onto this last, the exhibition that is open until the 1st of November, and we'd strongly encourage you to come down and see that on site before it closes. I'd also like to thank my co-host, Caris Martin, who has coordinated the talk this evening and has managed with all of our technical issues so brilliantly. And I do hope that if you've enjoyed this evening's talk, that you'll join us for our next in the series, Queering Spaces, which will launch in November as part of our Art in Action exhibition. And full details of all of our exhibitions and public programme can be found on our website. Again, Professor Tim Barringer, artist Edmund de Waal, thank you so much for a fabulous evening. We've got so much to take away from this evening, so thank you.